And we are underway. So welcome, LGFG friends. Are you looking good and feeling good? Yes, that's good. Well, I'm feeling good. I don't know if I look good, but I'm just the FG. That's the name of my company, FG. So that was a joke. All right, let's dive into our topic today. Last week we discussed briefly the law of legacy, which really, in talking with some of my rising leader buddies, it was a difficult concept because they were like, man, look, I'm 23 years old and you're talking about legacy and this long range thoughts. And it's hard to do, but it's useful. So you can create your future now by thinking about it in the present. You know, if you think about it now in the present, you can create your future immediately and move toward that. So we're going to turn from the law of legacy to how we get there. And the best way to get there is to really consider how to be effective with your time usage, right? So how we use our time to develop our theme that we talked about and our legacy. So I've got a couple questions for you to start with, and then I'm going to circle back at the end and we're going to ask those questions again, but I want you to think about them. You probably won't answer them immediately, but let me start off with the warm-up questions. Here's a warm-up question for your brain. What professional priorities, what priorities did you neglect last year in 2017? What were some professional things that you needed to do or improve on that you just neglected? It didn't go that well. Your priorities. And then how would you address them this year? All right, we're in February now, so the year has launched, but how would I address my big priorities in 2018? So that's the warm up. Now let me give you the two big questions. Question number one, what is one thing you could do that you aren't doing now that if you did it on a regular basis would make a tremendous difference in your personal life? I'll repeat that. What's one thing you could do that you are not doing right now that if you did it on a regular basis, you'd make it a habit, and that would make a tremendous difference in your personal life? Think about that. Second, number two, big question, which I'll repeat, is what's one thing in your business life that would bring similar results? What's one thing in your current professional life that would make a tremendous difference if you started doing it? So some of you are like, oh, okay, boom, you know immediately. And some of you are like, I need to think about that. And it would be great when we hang up, if you're not completely finished with your day and heading out the door, to consider that with your teammates. Yeah? If you have teammates. If you're sitting home alone, you can just consider in a lonely way those two questions. Right. So I've got two suggestions as we kind of work our way into that handout I emailed you. One is I would suggest, and some of you do this, taking your planning that you do into weekly blocks of time. Like some of the people I talked to said, well, I just do like a daily to-do list because I have things and tasks I need to do each day. That's true. Covey, our good friend, would say, don't just look at each day, but look at the whole week as a block of time. Okay, who does that? Raise your hand. Who plans for a whole week at a time? Yeah? Okay, good. Yoris, Andrew, kinda. He wanted to take credit. I know Jorgen does a good bit of that. I know when I talked to MB, she had talked about when she's on top of her game, she'll take time on Sundays to think and plan and reflect, and that gets her ready for the next big week. So that's number one assignment, is to not just pull out a scrap of paper and write down a to-do list or put it in your phone, but look at the whole week in a big chunk. All right, number two, which is our big topic today, is to think about Stephen Covey's time management matrix. And that is that little diagram that I emailed you as an attachment, right? So if you have that handy and you're looking at it, we're going to kind of go through what that, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you're going to have to picture this in your brain, which would be more difficult. All right. So this matrix kind of allows you to schedule your week according to what's most important to you, right? And what will have the most meaningful results if you use it correctly. So when we talked about Covey, we said there are 7 habits. And the first habit was being proactive. That means you are the programmer. You are the creator. You control your destiny, right? Good. The second item, habit number 2, is the actual creation part. Begin with the end in mind. Okay, I've got to think about what I want to create, right? And then habit 3 is putting first things first, and that's what we're talking about today. In fact, Covey has a whole book on this that I recommend called It's called First Things First. Makes sense. And it's designed to help you become a better manager of yourself, because some of you say, well, I'm not a manager. Well, yes, you are. You're a manager of yourself, if you hadn't realized that. So there are 4 quadrants on that diagram. You see a little diagram, which I'm representing with my arms. See? Very, very effective. Now, there's 2 axes or criteria that you evaluate your projects and tasks and everything you do. One is urgency, right? Urgency. And the other is importance. So urgent activities require immediate attention. Important ones contribute to your mission and your goals and your values, some of those things that we talk about from time to time. So my suggestion, if you don't get anything out of this call, here's the punchline. You want to focus most of your energy in quadrant 2. You want to do activities that are important, but not necessarily urgent. All right? So if we look, I'm going to open up my little Word doc here. And if you look at that matrix, you see that there are obviously 4 quadrants. And quadrant 1 is where many people spend most of their time, at work and sometimes at home, which is the quadrant of demand. Everything is being demanded of you. Things are urgent. Things are important. There are crises. There are pressing problems. There are deadlines you have to hit. If you're a parent and you have a child that wakes up in the middle of the night and she's crying, that is a quadrant 1 activity. You just don't roll over and go, take care of yourself, and go back to sleep. You have to get up and attend to that child. So that's an urgent activity, right? So some of those things are imposed on us by the people above us. You know, they make a request, we need to act, right? So that is quadrant 1. And according to Covey, quadrant 2, this is the the zone you want to get in. That's the zone you want to focus in. If you see where I put in red, the zone. That's where you're planning. That's where you're preventing problems. That's where you're creating. You're thinking of new ideas. How can we do this better? How can we have a better system? You're building relationships with people on your team because they impact you and you impact them, right? It's learning things. It's sharpening the saw a little bit. It's working out because you have to make sure that you can maintain your production capability, which we've talked about. So you'll want to stay out of quadrant 1, which is mostly just crises. And you want to stay out of quadrant 3, which is the next one we could talk about, which includes like interruptions, unnecessary meetings, work that fills your time. You know, if people just send you stuff and you're being active, you're not just totally flaking off, and you're doing things. But when you finish the day, I don't know if you've had a day where you did work, but you finished and you said, I don't know if I accomplished anything today. So those are interruptions. Those are other people coming to you and asking you things. A lot of times, that's maybe quadrant 1 for them. I've got a crisis. You've got to solve it. But for you, it's quadrant 3. It's urgent, but it's not important to your mission or your legacy or your goals. Okay? So we call that officially let me make this a little bigger so I can see it. We call that the quadrant of illusion. Okay? The quadrant of illusion. Right. And what that means is you're being, you're feeling busy, but that's not the key. That's not what's most important. And you can see listed there on my little sheet, pressing matters, sometimes popular activities, etc. And then quadrant 4, which I hope you're not spending much time at all in, especially at work. That would be really bad. That's how you lose your job. This is the quadrant of escape. This is not urgent and not important activities. Not urgent, not important. Could be busy work, time wasters, making a bunch of private calls. Hey, I think I'll check my Instagram. Wonder what's happening on Facebook right now. It won't hurt me to just go check into social media or see what's happening on Twitter. A lot of times that's just an escape hatch, if that makes sense. So very important that we consider these 4 quadrants. And if the more and more time you pour into quadrant 1, if you spend 90% of your time going from problem to problem, then your only mental escape is to go to quadrant 4 at the end of the day or during the day, is just to unplug and go, whew, man, I've got to recover because this really beat me up. A lot of people do spend a ton of time in quadrant 1, and that's not what we want to do. Okay? So it sounds simple, but the problem is we're far more likely to deal with urgent activities regardless of their importance, because they're right in front of our face, okay? And I think of the old days when I was working in a corporate office situation and I had email coming in, a phone ringing, a coworker barging in. As long as you focus on quadrant 1, you know, your day just emotionally drains you, okay? So you're in crisis mode. So Covey says this: urgent matters are usually visible. They press on us. They want action. They're often popular with other people to take care of their problems. But so often they're unimportant. All right, now, here's the deal. Quadrant 2, which is the zone of focus. On the other hand, it doesn't have any immediate consequences, so we're less likely to pay attention to quadrant 2. We put it off. But this is what we talked about on our videos. PPC balance, your production and your production capability. If you're neglecting quadrant 2, that's your production capability, right? So you can't just go and go and go and go and go and then never recharge or repair or maintain anything. So here's a good quote for you to think about. Either you run your day or your day runs you. Is that right? Has anybody had a day where you got run? Yes. Thank you for nodding. Either you run the day or the day runs you. And I've had many days like that, and it's not fun. Now, there's always going to be times where there's quadrant 1 stuff happening, but you just don't want to make that a habit. You want to spend as much time as possible, especially if you're a partner, especially if you're managing an office, especially if you're Deanie, being in quadrant 2, okay? Because that's where you're going to get the long range benefit. Okay, so think long term. The main takeaway here today is that you've got to take a step back so you can see the disparity between you and how you're spending your time and how you should spend your time. Okay? What's the difference between how I'm spending my time and how I should spend my time? That's the gap that we need to close in quadrant 2. So you can make a plan to adjust your schedule and allot more time and energy to the activities that help you in the long term. Okay? Instead of just activities that help you in the next 5 minutes to take the pressure off. All right. So here's what Covey says. I like this. He says, if you spend more time in quadrant 2, what happens is you'll end up with fewer quadrant 1 activities to deal with. Your problems will shrink to manageable proportions, which I like, because you're thinking ahead. You're doing the preventive things that keep the situations from developing to a big crisis later. All right? So that is the main thrust of what we want to talk about. This ties in beautiful with legacy. This ties in beautifully with PPC balance. You know, some of you heard the Covey material that we covered at Leeds or in DeVal, and you're like, yes, I need to sharpen the saw. I need to take care of myself and take care of relationships and plan ahead and do all these wonderful things. And then the minute Monday morning came, you're like, boom, phone calls, help, problems. I got to do a refit, help me. You know, all that stuff happens, and that's okay. But if your brain, when you're working on your week-long block of time and you're planning your time out, if you're thinking, start with your quadrant 2 first. What are my first things? What can I put them first? Let's put my first things first into the week. and then fill in the other stuff. Okay? So, not difficult. This is simple, but difficult to execute sometimes, right? So think about the questions we started the call with. The questions were, if you remember, and I'll repeat them because you need to write these down and think about them. What's one thing I could do that I'm not doing right now that if I did on a regular basis would make a tremendous difference in my personal life? And number two, same question for my business life. What's something I've not been doing that if I did on a regular basis would really impact my business life? My guess is those questions, the answer to those questions are quadrant 2 answers. They're deeply important, but they're not urgent, so people don't do them. So I'm going to challenge you to do those because it's like us to think long range. It's like us to plan ahead. It's like us to be preventative. It's like us to be creative and think of new ways to do what we do. Okay? So I will finish with 2 thoughts along with your questions. And well, let me give you an assignment. If you have that piece of paper that you printed, notice the bottom half of that paper is blank. So you can draw your grid, draw your own little matrix, quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, quadrant 4. And then this week, as you look at the week, it's already Monday, plan. Think, okay, what do I need to do this week? And let's start with that quadrant 2 box and plug that stuff in. Make a to-do list in the quadrant 2, and then maybe put some quadrant 1 stuff in. Don't spend a lot of time trying to fill up quadrant 4 because you're like, oh gosh, I've got to have all the boxes full. No, that would be bad. Like quadrant 4, more Facebook time. Yes, more selfies. That's what I need. A lot more selfies. Whatever. But really, the main 2 foci are quadrant 2 and then quadrant 1. Which is, you can't help, right? So as you think about that assignment and drawing your little box and working on that, remember the common denominator of success. I'll probably spend a call on this, but it was so important that some of you studied this and you have the pamphlet from years ago. But the common denominator of success, according to Albert Gray, who studied thousands of successful people and unsuccessful people, he found this: successful people form the habit of doing things unsuccessful people are not willing to do. Did you get that? Successful people form a habit of doing things that unsuccessful people aren't willing to do. So if you're not a student of the game, if you're not willing to make, X number of calls per day, if you don't have a goal in mind as far as bookings, you're just being active, whatever, quadrant 3, you're not probably going to be successful. Successful people form the habit of doing things unsuccessful people are not willing to do, right? So we're going to talk more about time as we get into future calls. I wanted you to start thinking about that and helping your teammates with their time, how they're spending your time. It doesn't mean you can't have any downtime. It doesn't mean you have to be busy and thinking long range 24 hours a day. There's a place for quadrant 3. There's a place for quadrant 4. That's okay. But it depends on how much time you're investing. I know people who watch TV for 6 to 8 hours a day, which is mostly what you'd call quadrant 4. And then they wake up and they're 50 years old and they're like, what happened to my life? It's because you invested your time in the wrong quadrant. All right. So enjoy your life, but plan your life and then execute. Either you run the day or the day runs you. So I'll finish with a quote from Goethe, our German philosopher. I think he's German. Goethe. Well, anyway, he said, things which matter most must never be at the mercy of things which matter least. Grasshopper, yes. Things which matter most must never be at the mercy of things which matter least. So keep that in mind this week. All right. Any thoughts or questions? You can unmute. Any examples from real life?
I have a question, Lee.
Yes.
I just thought it'd be good for us to have a question this time.
Sure.
So my question is so everything you said is all good and true, about the quadrants and quadrant 1, all that. And it's like when you feel good, like I can totally see these things applying. But does this still apply? Like if you like go through a day and you have 30 rejections in a row?
Yes.
It does. Okay, just making sure.
Okay, that was almost rhetorical.
Sometimes it just doesn't feel good, like.
Yes, that's true. Well, you know that common denominator of success, it doesn't say successful people form the habit of enjoying all the hard parts of their job. They really love getting no's. They love getting rejected all day long. That's not what it says. It says they form the habit of doing things that the unsuccessful people aren't willing to do. So
I appreciate that you cleared that up.
yeah. Well, thank you for asking. Anybody else? Anyone else out there? Okay. Well, go be successful, and we'll talk again next week. Tune in and get that sheet printed out so you can start thinking about your Q2 activities. Right? Right. Carry on. Have a good one. Thank you. See ya. Oh.